And our next speaker will be Jonah Chioniere, who is a professor at the Evolution Studies Institute at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. And he's going to be talking to us about the role of mass extinctions in shaping planetary biodiversity. So, Jonah?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm the professor of comparative paleobiology at Wits University, which is a fancy way of saying I'm a dinosaur researcher. And it's pretty humbling to go after the astronomer royal in the lineup and hear him say, I'm not really an expert in cosmology. And I guess I will give the same caveat that while I study a small portion of planetary biodiversity in the past, I can't claim to be an expert on planetary biodiversity overall. So please bear with me, and happy to discuss anything that might be controversial. I don't need to tell you again, but I'm going to do it anyway, that the world is undergoing a sixth major extinction. Vertebrate species, life in the seas, is going extinct at rates that are incredible and are faster than at any time in the last 400 years of recorded human history. The author Elizabeth Kolbert laid this out very clearly in her book, The Sixth Extinction. And it's been recently documented in a series of papers, hundreds of papers, really, including this one from Ceballos et al., just showing how fast modern biodiversity is going extinct. The scientific concept of extinction, which is, of course, sadly, so much a part of our ecosystem today, is actually surprisingly only a little more than 200 years old. That is sort of by the time that most scientists accepted extinction, accepted that it exists, humanity had already gone far down the path of causing irrevocable change to the planet's biodiversity. And it's really no surprise to me, and it probably won't be a surprise to you, that the concept of extinction was best laid out and really first laid out in its principles by a paleontologist, Georges Cuvier, who was working on mammoths in the late 1700s and early 1800s. So what Cuvier realized, and this is the sort of look I aspire to one day as a scientist. What Cuvier realized is that there were once animals on Earth that were no longer living, and that many of them looked like living animals, but they were differences. And those differences, although he didn't believe it, were evidence of evolution over time. What Cuvier did by saying that there are things that once lived here that no longer do, is he opened a great door of exploration. And that door of exploration is the discipline of paleosciences, and that door leads into sort of parts of time unknown. And understanding our current extinction event really requires an understanding of the deep time Earth biodiversity, not just the last 400 years, but really the vast history of life on this planet, which goes back at least 3.5 to 4 billion years. And I think that tells us strongly that the world needs paleontologists, right? The fossil record documents this vast sort of series of natural experiments in evolution. And the job that we paleontologists have is to gather information on the distribution, abundance, and forms of life over time, so that we can actually understand how these natural experiments played out. And so if we can combine an understanding of the geological age of the Earth, which we do by examining the strata that Ray Troll so brilliantly illustrated here, if we can combine that understanding of the geological age of the Earth with the knowledge of the distribution, that is the temporal distribution of species and their geographic distributions, we can answer some really fundamental and interesting questions, like how many species have ever lived on Earth? Do the distributions of species today match distributions of species in the past? Are the animals that live together today, are they just sort of random associations, or they're like long-lasting ecological communities that persist over millions of years? Other questions like, were ancient ecosystems like modern ecosystems? How fast do new species form? How long does it take to evolve new innovations like huge body size in whales? And are these innovations immediately successful? That's really the purview of paleontology. And it all gets back to trying to decipher the meaning of those vast natural experiments that have played out over the history of life on Earth. I want to just focus on one of those questions at first here, to give context to why I think mass extinctions are so important. How long does a species last? It's a fundamental question. And it tells us things like how many species we can expect to go extinct in a time interval, let's say the last 400 years of natural history observations. And that observation is what we call the background extinction rate. And the background extinction rate is sort of a logical follow-on from Cuvier's hypothesis that the strange elephant-like jaws he was describing belonged to animals that were no longer alive. So once you establish extinction exists, you really want to immediately know, well, how often does it occur? Is it a fact of life? And scientists working in highly fossiliferous layers, like this one on the left, this is the John Day fossil beds in sort of central Oregon, combined with excellent sort of radiometric dating of sediments, can show that extinction is the norm. It happens all the time. And in fact, we can calculate a background rate of extinction. So in this sequence of rocks here, I'm showing you part of it. It spans about 40 million years. And a team of researchers there have determined that about every million years, you see two extinctions. That is, you see two extinctions per million species years. If you have 1 million species in an area, 2 would be expected to go extinct in any given year. And a really great perspective on this is given by the Howard Hughes Medical Institute video, which I'll post in the links after my talk. So we can use this background rate of extinction from the fossil record to assess our current rates of biodiversity change. And that type of research, like the stuff that goes on at John Day fossil beds, shows that there's about 5,500 mammal species alive today. And at a background rate of 2 extinctions per million species years, we would expect about 1 of those mammal species to go extinct every 100 years. In the last 100 years, we've seen 43 mammal species go extinct, and that's documented here in this Ceballos diagram. So what is a mass extinction? If we have a background rate of extinction, and we can calculate that, what is a mass extinction? We know that extinction is a fact of life, but the fossil record tells us that there's periods in Earth's history when the extinction rate briefly increases to extremely high levels, and that happens without a corresponding increase in the speciation rate. The net result of that is a biodiversity crisis, a relatively brief time where you experience extreme biodiversity loss. And many of you will be familiar with this curve on the left. This is the famous Sepkoski curve, derived from Jack Sepkoski's work in Chicago, as well as David Raup's studies. And this documents marine biodiversity over the Phanerozoic. Initially, they calculated the number of families that were present in given time intervals. We have Cambrian at the left here. Can't quite find my cursor, but there it is, Cambrian at the left, all the way through to what was called the Tertiary at that time on the right. And what Sepkoski and Raup documented was that there are times when the number of families take tremendous dips, when marine biodiversity really experiences heavy losses. And they identified these extinctions as the Big 5 mass extinctions. A more modern view of this curve, with quite a bit more data thrown at it and some sampling standardizations, shows more or less the same thing. There are at least 5, and possibly a few more these days, clear spikes of extreme biodiversity loss in Earth's history. And to cover the big ones, we have at the far left, the end Ordovician extinction. It happens at about 440 million years ago. And we lose about 50% of marine genera at that time. The late Devonian extinction, which occurs coincidentally with the rise of tetrapods at about 372 million years ago. And we're still debating how much diversity is lost in that extinction. The famous Great Dying or End Permian extinction at about 250 million years ago, where we lose almost everything that was alive, up to 95% of species and 80% of marine genera. We almost didn't make it. The End Triassic extinction at 201 million years, where we lose 35% of marine genera, and the End Cretaceous extinction, the famous one that killed the dinosaurs, that happened about 65 million years ago and wiped out between 30 and 50% of marine genera. Now, interestingly, the causes of these mass extinctions are hotly debated, and I could spend the rest of the talk telling you about those causes. I want to actually tell you about the effects instead, but you'll see in this chart that they range from glaciation, that is rapid cooling of the Earth, to cooling combined with ocean anoxia and rapid warming, to flood volcanism, that is the distribution of huge amounts of basalt on the surface of the Earth, and to, of course, what is the exception rather than the norm, it appears, the meteorite strike at the end of the Cretaceous. I also want you to remember that the fossil record of mass extinctions is really only 20% of the history of widespread life on Earth. We don't really have the ability to document extinctions in the Archean and the Proterozoic. They're paleontologically invisible, so to speak, but I would predict that they would have been there as well. So, okay, if we have a mass extinction as a short period when the background rate of extinction spikes and we get a sharp drop in planetary biodiversity, the next thing we need to tackle is really what is biodiversity? Is losing a single coral reef with 1,000 fish species different from losing a herd of 1 million migrating black wildebeest? Well, generally, when people talk about mass extinctions, and particularly when paleontologists talk about them, we are measuring alpha diversity. That is the number of species or genera, depending on your level of inquiry, that are present in a given time period. And we often compare that to the species or generic count of another time period. That obviously obscures other aspects of biodiversity, like the diversity of ecosystem roles, which I would call sort of jobs. That's functional diversity, or things like relative abundance, case in point the wildebeest, or distributions, geographic distributions of some species. And so for the rest of this talk, I want to consider first alpha diversity and what are the planetary effects on just the sheer number of species and mass extinctions, and then delve into some of these slightly harder aspects of diversity, that is functional diversity, jobs, and relative abundance and geographic distributions, what I would call the biogeography of diversity. When considering alpha diversity, it's really helpful to go back to some wonderful, incredibly powerful pioneering mathematical work of people like Frank Preston, MacArthur and Wilson, and so forth. And these guys made natural history observations, which they were able to codify into a series of what are pretty much ecological laws. And I think they're extremely relevant for understanding alpha diversity in deep time. And I want to just remind you of them now. So on the left here, we have a graph by Preston, who is taking suburban bird censuses in Maryland in the US, and in addition to a number of things. And what Preston found was if you plotted the log number of individuals of a given species, versus the number of species showing that number of individuals, you get a curve like the one on the left. And this curve tells us that there are a very small number of species, that is on the far right in the tail of this curve, that are extremely abundant. So relatively few species are common. This is surprising to me, actually, when I first learned this, and that under the meaty part of the curve here, as you head left, there are a large number of species that are either uncommon or rare. And if you take a morning bird walk through my neighborhood in Johannesburg, or in fact, through Central Park in New York, or other places I've lived, you can easily confirm that. You'll see dozens of common things here, like the Hadida ibis, but you'll only see a handful of a whole variety of rare species. You may see quite a few rare species, but only one or two of them. And I think that may be somewhat counterintuitive, but it's directly applicable to the fossil record. The fossil record is like taking a bird walk, but you only get to walk one step and you only get to do it once a year. We have terrible sampling rates. 1 in a million animals gets fossilized. 1 in a million fossils is ever discovered and studied. In my lab, it seems to be about 1 in 1,000 fossils we dig up ever makes it to publication. And so you might understand in the fossil record that if we look at this distribution of species, which we think may be shaped like Preston's model over time, we're likely missing a huge portion of paleo-alpha diversity. That is, we're not sampling enough of this curve to really get all of those rare species out of it. And we can combine that observation, as MacArthur and Wilson did, with the another powerful observation, which is a species area curve. This is been described as the closest thing to a law we have in ecology, and it simply says that if you take an island and you log its area in square miles and you count the number of species on that island and log it, when you plot them, there will be a straight line, and that line will increase the diversity of species, that is the alpha diversity of species, will increase in a predictable way with the area of that island. And so that tells you that land area has a powerful positive correlation with alpha diversity. The bigger the island, the more species it has. Now we can take these and use these observations about modern alpha diversity and extend them to our studies of the fossil record. So down here in southern Africa, we have an abundance of basins that preserve the remains of ancient life. I'll tell you more about them at the end of my talk. And if I compare the main Karoo Basin, the big blue blob at the bottom, which covers nearly 2/3 of South Africa's land surface, if I were to compare that with the smaller Tule Basin up to the north, right at the boundary between Botswana, Zimbabwe, and South Africa, and I find that the main Karoo has 4 times as many dinosaur species as the Tule, is that a fair comparison? Well, no. And the reason why is the species area effect. Greater sampling area in the main Karoo equals more species we'd expect to find. It also means that with the greater sampling, we'd expect to find more of those rare species under Preston's curve, simply because we have a greater number of observations. It also extends to collecting efforts. If I'm the only paleontologist studying dinosaurs in the Triassic of South Africa, I really can't compare the species counts that I get of alpha diversity to the whole community of Triassic dinosaur paleontologists working in the Northern Hemisphere on 3 different continents. And so any metric of alpha diversity, any question about alpha diversity in deep time really requires some sort of statistical correction for these species area effects and the canonical order of how common species are. My friend Roger Benson, who teaches at Oxford now, another fine institution, Lord Rees, once came and asked every single person in my department when they thought Earth held the most species. When was the planet most biodiverse? And in fact, it turns out he was going to a lot of different labs and asking people the same question. And he came back and he told me, after this intensive period of interrogation, he said, you know, not a single scientist, not a single paleontologist he knew gave him the same answer. So when was the Earth maximally biodiverse? Was it in the Cambrian? Was it in the Mesozoic in the age of the dinosaurs? Was it at the start of the age of mammals? Is it in fact 400 years ago, before humans started to have such a detrimental impact on species? And his answer was, well, we can't tell. And the reason why we can't tell is just what I said. The fossil record deteriorates over time, and species area effects begin to dominate our interpretations of alpha diversity. So what Roger and his postdoc and a few of his grad students set about doing was to try to find ways to statistically correct for these species area effects. And they hit upon a method using a statistical approach called MinimumSpanning Trees. And essentially what it does is it takes all occurrences of fossils on Earth, at least for vertebrates over the last 250 million years, and subsamples them to standard areas. And what he found was really curious. And here's one of the results of a study by Roger Close, his postdoc, and Roger Benson and others. And if we plot time on the x-axis and a standardized species richness, that is a standardized alpha diversity on the y-axis, what we find is when we correct for the species area effect and we correct for biases in sampling, that over the entire Mesozoic, that is from the Permo-Triassic extinction on the left, marked by this red arrow, through the end Triassic extinction, all the way up to the end of the age of dinosaurs, we see a few percent increase in alpha diversity. That is, over nearly 200 million years, the Earth appears to have had a constant number of vertebrate species. I think that was really surprising to me when I first read this paper, and I thought this can't be. And subsequent papers using this method have backed this observation up. What they also observed was that after this sort of long period of stasis, and maybe this is comparable to the stasis in passenger jets or the stasis in iPhones, is that after this long period of stasis, there is a tremendous jump after the end Cretaceous extinction, after that meteorite struck Earth, and the alpha diversity of vertebrates on the planet increases by something like 4 or 5-fold. We'll come back to this observation at the end of the talk. Okay, so if we now have a toolkit to study mass extinctions and alpha diversity, and we now know something about alpha diversity, that there may be long periods in Earth's history when it doesn't really increase, let's turn our attention to functional diversity. And functional diversity is quite a hot button issue in ecology. I know I'm going to get hate mail from my colleagues and friends about this, but to simply put it out there, functional biodiversity really explains the breadth of specialization in ecological communities. It doesn't have to vary with alpha diversity, although it does. So an area low in species, numbers of species can contain species that have many different roles. And an area rich in species might contain many taxa with overlapping roles in the ecosystem. We can also consider other aspects of diversity here, other than sort of jobs, like things like body size, that's a functional metric, or innovation ability, if we can find a way to measure that. And those are kind of shown here by the diversity in forms that fish take, from one morphological extreme to another, to the various body sizes of dinosaurs, which range from a hummingbird up to sort of the 60-ton sauropod size. Well, how do mass extinctions affect functional diversity? If you have a huge biodiversity crisis, do we lose jobs? Do we lose individuals of certain body sizes? Do we lose innovation ability or gain it? Those are kind of open questions in mass extinction studies. But I'll cover a couple of the more persistent hypotheses that we've started to test. So one of the most persistent ideas about the role of extinctions in functional diversity is what we call the Lilliput effect. And that's the observation that the mean body size of groups decreases in the wake of a mass extinction event. From Gulliver's Travels, the Lilliputians were obviously the small group of people that Gulliver encounters. And there are a number of sort of causal explanations for why this might be. Decreased resource availability in a post-extinction environment, earlier sexual maturity, that is, animals that are able to mate earlier are able to produce offspring before the bad extinction environment catches up with them, shorter generation time, same idea, et cetera, et cetera. But we can actually look at the Lilliput effect with simple metrics of body size if we can measure the body size of animals in a sort of geological time interval. And Adam Huttenlocher did that in 2014, and a number of other people have as well. I just wanted to flag his research here. He looked across the Permo-Triassic boundary, that is the end Permian extinction. And what he found was that there is a sudden decrease in sort of the size of the skulls of mammal relatives that happens just exactly at the time of the Permo-Triassic extinction crisis. And that rapidly after that, the maximum body size increases rapidly for a number of groups. And so there is some evidence that the Lilliput effect does act on vertebrates. That is, extinctions could have predictable effects on the mean body size of organisms in ecosystems. Another persistent idea about mass extinctions, and one that's kind of much harder to test, is this idea that extinctions would lead to innovations, that is, functional gains of function or gains of functional diversity, right? New things get invented because there's a wide open slate to invent them in, a tabula rasa in the strictest evolutionary sense. And I could have plotted dozens of things on this sort of timeline of extinctions, but I just wanted to say that the answer to this is complicated. Innovations such as flight in birds evolve in the Jurassic, well separated from any major extinction events, and they lead to adaptive radiations in birds very quickly. By the early Cretaceous, birds are already rapidly diversifying at extremely high rates, and then they do it again across the end Cretaceous extinction, whereas a group like mammals, here pictured with this little rat-like silhouette in the star, they evolve also in between mass extinctions, and they kind of persist in relatively low numbers for a very long time, traversing an extinction event, but not experiencing a burst in innovation afterwards. And then only in the wake of the end Cretaceous do mammals finally become dominant in terrestrial ecosystems. And so there may be a decoupling between innovation and mass extinctions. That is, it's not clear that resetting the clock necessarily promotes innovation, but in some cases, as in birds, it may allow latent innovations to suddenly be useful. And I was listening to a podcast about the nature of invention and patents and the adoption of technology the other night. And that was one of the messages of this podcast, was that often things are invented and it's not the initial invention that leads to their widespread adoption. It's actually, there's a long fuse during which it's not clear how that technology is useful, and then suddenly something trips. Now that might be a mass extinction. It might just be a sudden shift in relative fitness. So more work clearly needs to be done here. The last aspect of functional diversity that I'll talk about in the context of mass extinction is what I call jobs, right? And it's all about the economy. And one of the ways to view the functional biodiversity on Earth is to ask, well, how many different kinds of solutions to problems have been evolved? How many different types of feeding? There's sessile filter feeders, there's active pursuit predators. Those are different strategies to survive and to increase your fitness, well, ultimately, which result in increased fitness. And a number of researchers have actually gone through and tried to simplify the roles that animals play, mostly animals, although there are several plant studies on this, tried to simplify the roles that these animals and plants play in the ecosystem, and then calculate at any given time, using fossils, can we say, well, did those jobs exist? And how common were those jobs? How many animals were employed in that sector? And all of this, of course, is in quotes. And for example, this Dunhill et al. Study in 2017 classified a bunch of marine fossils in terms of their feeding modes and their locomotory modes. And then they plotted the relative abundance of those modes, those jobs, over the Triassic-Jurassic extinction. And you can see their graph here. What it shows us is that there may be shifts across extinction events, and the extinction event is right at that 200 mark there, where you see a bunch of sort of pointed triangles going down. What they found is that there may be shifts in the relative abundances of those jobs. That is, certain sectors suffer heavier losses than others, but almost no sectors go extinct. That is, no job that is created, that is, no functional role that animals evolve, is generally completely destroyed by an extinction event. And I think this is really powerful because it tells us that the jobs of the past may be the jobs of the future for organisms. That is, functions once evolved are sticky in an evolutionary sense. And it may be that the people or the organisms that fill those jobs differ over time, but the jobs remain. And from my own research, I like to think that that may be true of the end Triassic extinction on land. In the Triassic, we see a bunch of things that are related to crocs called pseudoseuchians, filling large-bodied vertebrate roles like big carnivore, big herbivore, small generalist herbivore, small specialist herbivore. And the end Triassic extinction wipes out much of that diversity on sort of the line that leads to today's crocs. But those jobs persist, and they're rapidly filled by dinosaurs, who often come to resemble the animals from a totally different part of the evolutionary tree that once held those jobs. And so jobs. Well, jobs seem to be somewhat immutable. And the last part of my talk, the last thing that I want to cover, is the role that mass extinctions play in what I'm going to call biogeographic diversity. That's only because I lack a better term for it. And I've heard it said by many of colleagues and parents in various ways that when mass extinction closes a door, available data suggests it opens a window. And I think this is a really nice way to think about mass extinctions. For the taxa that manage to survive one, or that rapidly evolve in the wake of a mass extinction, the world is sort of their proverbial oyster. There's many open jobs potentially that still need organisms to fill them. But there are also other predictions for how those survivors might affect biodiversity. And I'll just focus on two here. The first is cosmopolitanism. Hard one to say at this hour, cosmopolitanism. And there's a commonly held idea that in the aftermath of a mass extinction, surviving taxa can rapidly expand their geographic ranges. That is, they can more easily inhabit niche space because it's not so densely occupied by other animals. The prediction of this idea of increasing cosmopolitanism is that the interconnectedness of different geographic areas of the globe will increase in the wake of a mass extinction, basically as taxa, as the ranges of species and genera expand. This illustration this figure is from a recent paper by Button et al. And they studied this phenomenon using sort of a means for correcting for phylogenetic relationships. And what they found is that over two extinctions, what they've called the PTB here, that's the Permo-Triassic extinction, and the end Triassic extinction, the TJB on the right, what they found was that this blue, sort of blue shaded polygon, which represents how interconnected different faunas around the world are, what they found was, yes, there's strong support for cosmopolitanism appearing in the wake of a mass extinction. That is, a bunch of things go extinct, and the immediate biotic response is that the survivors expand their ranges. This happens at the Permo-Triassic boundary very strongly, and that's got a large sample size driving it, so I think it's more believable and possibly just showing a stronger trend. And that cosmopolitanism decreases throughout the Triassic into the late Triassic when it becomes extremely small. So we first see widespread animals, and then we see regional differentiation into localized clades. And then yet again at the Triassic-Jurassic boundary, boom, we lose species, and the ones that survive greatly expand their range. So, and then yet again, it decreases as we head into the Jurassic. So cosmopolitanism does appear to be a biogeographic effect of a mass extinction. The second commonly observed phenomenon that I want to talk to you about in this context is really in regards to relative abundance of taxa across an extinction event. And we are increasingly seeing in the fossil record what we call disaster faunas. And this is the observation that a certain small set of organisms become, or species become, extremely common in the wake of a mass extinction, and their relative abundance might increase to sort of 70% of all fossils found immediately after the extinction, and then rapidly decreases. And this appears to be something about the ecosystem disruption caused by the mass extinction allows a small number of organisms with advantageous traits to just explosively diversify. And a wonderful example of this is Lystrosaurus, evidence for global plate tectonics as well. But Lystrosaurus is an extremely common mammalian relative from South Africa. Nat Geo called it the humble badass of the Triassic. And Lystrosaurus starts off as a relatively insignificant member of faunas, shown by this purple line on the top graph. And by the time of the Permian extinction is almost 70% of occurrences. So 70% of fossils we find are Lystrosaurus, and then it rapidly falls off the table. Okay, so examining how these many factors contribute to extinctions and respond to extinctions, we can kind of bin them into two categories. First, intrinsic biotic factors, such as competition between species or exploitation of one species by another. And the other is abiotic factors, such as rapid climate change, that 20-kilometer diameter asteroid hitting the Earth at the end of the Cretaceous, rampant volcanism, et cetera. And so we commonly call these the Red Queen hypothesis. That is, biotic factors drive extinction and species competition push each other to either evolve or to go extinct. And on the right-hand side, the opposite or the complement of that is the court jester. That is, extinctions in planetary biodiversity is largely driven by random events that we can't predict. And the role that those two ideas, and they really are ideas because it's kind of an artificial dichotomy, the role they play in planetary diversification really suggests quite different patterns for biodiversity over time. And commonly these are called bound and unbound diversification. So bounded diversification, which is sort of the Red Queen hypothesis, and I'll tell you about marrying the court jester in a second, is that as species become, as we get higher alpha diversity, competition gets more intense and it drives up the extinction rate, and so we can't get any more species. And this is the idea of a carrying capacity. And so if we think about how that biodiversity curve might look over time, if the Red Queen effects dominate, what we'd see is a rapid, let's start at the left, on the left side of this graph, a rapid increase of species number from some starting point, which asymptotically tapers off as we approach Red Queen sort of saturation, and then bam, an extinction event comes and it resets the clock. And then we rapidly respeciate, generate alpha diversity, and that decreases as Red Queen saturation happens, and then bam, a mass extinction, and so forth. So what this looks like is sort of standing waves of biodiversity over time. The opposite of that is unbounded diversification, and that might be when court jester effects dominate and the Red Queen doesn't play a role in planetary biodiversity. And under that model, we might expect increasing biodiversity that exponentially increases as species divide and divide niches into smaller and smaller partitions, and then occasional resets with a mass extinction killing off a bunch of those species. And maybe if the extinction isn't severe enough, species reach new and higher peaks with every iteration between court jester effects. Now, the data that I presented to you before falsify this second one, this unbounded diversification. In fact, this illustration from Close et al. Shows that when we can actually make meaningful comparisons between equal areas in Earth's history, we see that really species diversity doesn't increase over vast periods of time. That suggests that there may be Red Queen effects that dominate for most of the age of dinosaurs, for example. But it also suggests that occasionally we can break out of this Red Queen. We can break out of some sort of carrying capacity like we do at the end of the Cretaceous and achieve a new peak in alpha diversity. The question is, how? And that's still being answered. So I'm supposed to tell you guys how this is useful to the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, and I'm not sure I'll be able to convince you it is, but let me have a go at it. What I want to say is, if we're out there searching for life on other planets and hoping that some of it is sentient, we're going to have to accept that extinction is a fact of that life. If we have any concept of life plus some evolution occurring, we get a background rate of extinction, possibly because of red queen effects. But the upshot of that is that even if most species are rare, some of them should be common enough to detect in a planetary fossil record. And that means that if life is out there and that life existed on some planet we're trying to explore, we should be able to find it, even if it has gone extinct. It tells us that mass extinctions are difficult to predict. So large-scale extinctions are infrequent enough and have enough diverse causes that we can't necessarily generalize about when they're going to occur, how they're going to occur, or maybe even the total effect of them. Interestingly, life is highly resilient to mass extinctions. There's been so many in planetary history, but life not only manages to make it through each one, it rebounds extremely quickly in the aftermath of those mass extinctions. That's why we can look across that Mesozoic corrected record and we don't actually even see the extinction events. It also tells us that functional diversity, that is jobs, may be less affected by extinctions than alpha diversity. So jobs may remain. Organisms that do different things may persist across mass extinctions, even if the numbers of species do not. A related corollary of this, which I didn't have time to discuss, is that the resilience to that is hard to predict, but it does appear to be driven by broad geographic distributions. That is, the more broad your geographic distribution is, the more likely you are to survive a mass extinction. And the upshot of all this is, on a sufficiently large planet, if life evolves, we have a good chance of finding it. And so I'd like to end with just one quick musing, if you'll indulge me yet again. Actually, two quick musings. But the first is, one of the fascinating things about planetary biodiversity is that a number of animals have sort of hitched themselves to our wagon in the dramatic rise in human population. And that includes, of course, the cockroach, the Norway rat, the domestic pigeon, and all of our domestic animals and plants. In fact, Michael Pollan wrote that in many ways, corn domesticated us, right? And the same can be said for wheat, barley, et cetera, et cetera. And Jared Diamond pointed this out in that sort of classic book, Guns, Germs, and Steel. And he says, there's so much natural diversity in native grain crops, but humans have only harnessed and exploited a small percentage of that. That is, very few species become agricultural successes. Essentially, those species have tricked us into modifying habitat to suit their needs, and they've been able to persist and flourish in huge numbers across wide regions, even at low alpha and sort of functional diversity. And in this way, maybe they'd be the most likely candidates to survive mass extinctions, but their rise and the rise of domesticated animals and humans is also eerily similar to the effects of a mass extinction. And maybe it's hard to see an extinction that you're in the middle of, so to speak. So finally on this, it seems like to me that domestication isn't necessarily a human construct. Plenty of invertebrates serve as ecosystem engineers in the same way, favoring certain species they depend on, such as ants and fungus. And one might expect that sophisticated forms of life on other planets would have done the same. So depending on the resource base of those planets and how it's exploited by those beings, that itself might be a huge future driver of extinctions, not just on this planet, but on other planets in the solar system, well, in the galaxy and beyond. I'd just like to make a last note that working here in Africa is just been a tremendous experience for me. Obviously, I'm an American by my accent. And many of these extinction studies that I cited today are based on the African fossil record, which is truly superb and just such a pleasure to study. And I just want to point out to you guys how much of a role that Afro-extinctionism plays in our understanding of planetary biodiversity. And I think that that's a trend that will continue to grow. And of course, I invite you as researchers and members of the interested public to participate in that and sort of the primal role that Africa plays in understanding sort of where we came from and where we're going. And with that, having gone over by 3 minutes, I'll say thank you very much, and I'd be delighted to answer any questions.